Hello and welcome to Taiwan Talks. I'm Ian Kavat. Alongside Taiwan, the disputed South China Sea is often cited as a flashpoint between the United States and China. Today, we find out why and ask whether the risk of escalation is real. With me to discuss this are Sana Hashmi, Taiwan-Asia Exchange Foundation Postdoctoral Fellow and former Taiwan Ministry of Foreign Affairs National Zhengzhou University Institute of Relations Fellow, and Guermantes Lailari, retired U.S Air Force Foreign Area Officer and former U.S Air Force Attache in the Middle East. Sana, Guermantes, very warm welcome to the show today. But first, in Taiwan, Beijing has walked back a no-fly zone of 3 days in Taiwan's airspace to less than 30 minutes. The cause for the restriction was unclear. South Korea, which was also briefed by Beijing, said it was due to an object falling from a satellite launch vehicle. No-fly zones formed part of China's response to former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in August last year. They were designed to cause disruption to air traffic in Taiwan's busy airspace.
这大概距离台湾北面大概85海里左右。那北部呢，大家也都知道北部这个不管是往日本、韩国，是往美国整个国际航路是非常多的。
G-Man, what's the message behind the no-fly zone, and what sort of disruption does the 3 days versus the 27 minutes make?
I think it was a mistake on the PRC's part to announce a 3-day no-fly zone. And obviously when it was questioned, they rolled back to the 27 minutes. And based on my research and my contacts, it appears that they're going to launch something out of their Jiuyan space launch station around that time. And it's typical to make sure that that area is cleared in case there's an accident.
Okay, so you see it as perfectly viable.
I think it was misinterpreted as part of the aggression that was occurring here. I think it's where one hand doesn't know what the other hand is doing, and it was interpreted as part of the military exercise that was being conducted. I don't believe it's at all connected.
Okay, so Sana, that might explain why Taiwan says that it was able to reduce or persuade the Chinese to reduce the impact of it, and surely if this was to do with aggression, that wouldn't be the case.
Yeah, I think it's a part of non-conventional military intimidation. But I think what it reflects first is that the channel of communication still open despite escalation and tension. And second, this falsifies the narrative that DPP is actually leading Taiwan towards war. What DPP wants is the status quo, and I think this negotiation of from 3 days to 27 minutes actually tells us that. And third, I feel that there is the escalation. China doesn't want the escalation of tension specifically. This is a very particularly important year for China as well. And the escalation might actually impact the public perception in Taiwan. And what they want, the Chinese want, is DPP to not come back to power.
Guermantes, so do you agree? A positive sign, communication is open.
Yes, I mean I think the DPP can take advantage of the reaction. But it does show how it wasn't just the Taiwan that was reacting to this no-fly zone. It was also Japan and South Korea also reacted to it and thought it was really out of control. But it shows also that those countries besides Taiwan are in collaboration and coordination, which is a good thing. It again demonstrates what Sana is saying, is that there is a sense of unity amongst the nations close at least to the east of China.
G-Man, so you've actually prepared a map for us of the flight path of the satellite launch vehicle. Let's take a look at that map now. Tell us what this red line is.
The line is the launch path of the satellite launching into space, and so along that launch path, the airspace has to be cleared for safety reasons in case there's a breakup or explosion or some kind of an event, and that's why the area that's associated with the Taiwan ADIZ was requested to be no-fly area during that launch period.
So this must happen quite often then?
Well, this launch site is not used too much. It's actually used mainly for a human spaceflight, and so the PRC has a planned manned mission in May, and this might be a launch for that because they might have rolled it back. We don't really know exactly when they're going to launch, so this could be a launch of one of their to their Chinese space station.
So in conclusion, you believe it's quite feasible to have this reason for the no-fly zone?
Yes, 23 minutes is actually a pretty short period of time. If it was 3 days, it would be excessive and cause a lot of disruption. So I don't believe it's the case that it was intentional. I believe it was a mistake on the PRC side to announce a 3-day window.
Sana, do you agree? Do you think it was a mistake?
I think it was just a way to have leverage that, you know, we are actually reducing it because Taiwan has come to us. I don't think it was a mistake. I think it's a very well thought out plan.
So the South China Sea is one of the world's busiest sea lanes. Between 3 and 4 trillion US dollars of trade, roughly 1/3 of global trade, passes through it every year. That's over half of the world's oil tanker traffic and over half of the world's cargo or passenger fleet by tonnage. It's a vital sea link between the Indian and Pacific Oceans. Let's take a look at a map of the South China Sea and the overlapping claims. Here, in our first map, we can see the disputed islands, the Paracels and the Spratlys, lying between 6 neighbouring countries. That's China, Taiwan, Vietnam, Malaysia, the Philippines and Brunei. And we've also circled in each of these maps Taiping Island, on which Taiwan has troops stationed. Now, the area on the next map shows the area claimed by China, which is represented by this red line. That's roughly 80 to 90% of the South China Sea and loops in a U as far as 1,500 kilometers off China's coast. And then in the final map you can see here, we can see the blue line, which are the waters where each country is entitled to drill for oil or to fish off their coastlines, which is under UN law. Now, in 2016, an international tribunal ruled that China's claims to the South China Sea, the red line, had no legal basis, but there is no way to enforce the legally binding judgment. G-Man, so let's talk about China's claims within the red dotted line. And there's a map that we have here, which is called the 9-dash line. Tell us about this map. Where did it come from?
It came from the Department of State, the U.S. Department of State, describing the 2 maps that were provided by the PRC. The 9-dash line was originally, quote unquote, discovered in the 1950s, and then in 1991, the PRC declared the South Asian Sea, I prefer to call it the South Asian Sea instead of the South China Sea, as their territorial area. Then in 2009, they extended it to what they call the 10-dash line, which includes Taiwan. So when you talk about the so-called South China Sea, you need to also understand that includes Taiwan. So that's what this map shows.
So in fact, we should be referring to it as the 10-dash line in terms of what China now claims.
Correct.
Right. Okay. And that wasn't in the original 9-dash line of the ROC, which is Taiwan. Is that correct?
Correct.
Yeah. Okay. Sana, let's talk about why is the South China Sea. Let's put Taiwan aside for one segment. Let's talk about why is the South China Sea so valuable to China.
It's very important economically as well as strategically, and we just looked at the map. And if we look at the map, the 9-dash line actually depicts that China claims the entire South China Sea. And in fact, if I may quote a former PLA Navy commander, he actually said whoever controls the Spratlys is going to reap military and economic benefits. So, of course, there are tangible economic benefit. 1/3 of the trade passes through it, 80% of the crude oil import passes through South China Sea, and apart from that, it is a home of proven 700 billion oil as well as 900 trillion cubic feet natural gas. So it's a lot of natural resources. If China control it, it will be very powerful. But apart from that, there are a lot of strategic benefit as well.
Yeah, you mentioned military. Talk a bit about that.
So if China controls it, or for example, if China invades a war on Taiwan, the area which China claims, if it's under its control, it is going to act as buffer, and China has submarine nuclear bases in the sea. So it's going to be very, very important for China from the military aspect as well. So of course, it's just not about one area. There are economic, strategic as well as military benefits for China.
G-Man, I know that you are going to talk about oil fields, but before that, let's talk a little bit more about the military. Sana mentioned submarines.
So in addition to what you showed about the island that Taiwan has, the PLA has several islands that it occupies or created out of nothing. And now they have at least 4 military bases, full military bases with 10,000-foot runways which can handle bombers and tankers. So this, on the military side, is huge. Second of all, on the seaside, all these islands that the PRC controls has port facilities for any of their ships. And the third thing I'd just like to point out is that
so that means that they can refuel.
Yes, refuel and also recover in case they're attacked. They can go to port and get repaired. The other thing I would like to point out is the idea that the PLA has been doing a lot of harassment activities in that area, in the South Asian Sea, against not only the U.S. but against Australia, against Vietnam, against the Philippines, against almost all the countries in that area. And the last thing I'd just like to point out is the fact that by having this additional area, the PRC will now border, in effect, those countries. So it did not have a border with Malaysia, now it will. It did not have a border with the Philippines, now it will.
So what does the border mean?
It means that it can apply pressure, it can control the ocean, it can use it as a means of coercion should it choose to.
Okay, and how much? Let's show the map which shows the oil fields within the South China Sea here. If you could talk us through those and just say, I mean, I think it's the light brown patches. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Yeah.
The patchy areas are the areas where there has been oil and gas discovered. And so you can see some of it in the northern part is already under the PRC control, but the southern regions, there's a lot of other opportunity. The PRC, one of the famous politicians in the PRC called the so-called South China Sea the Persian Gulf of China. In fact, the amount of oil, as Sana mentioned, is, just to give an equivalent, is 80% of what the known oil reserves of Saudi Arabia is equivalent to what's out there in the so-called South China Sea.
Amazing.
Sana, sorry, one more thing. And just to connect a little bit on size, the South Asian Sea is the same size as India.
Okay. Sana, how long has China been, asserting their claims over this? This has not been a short-term thing, has it?
PRC actually inherited ROC's claim, so it has been going on for decades, and how they are basing their claim is that China was the first one, like they are going millennia back, that they were the first one to discover and name the island in the South China Sea.
Yeah, and so this name, I mean, Guermantes very interestingly brought up the name South Asian Sea. So you're saying that it was actually China itself that named...
This is what they claim, like they have historical claims. I think it's just not about their maritime claims. When you look at the land border claims, it's also been inherited ROC's, they have inherited ROC's claim. So I think what they're just trying to do, and that this is all a part of that cutting of Chinese melon, century of humiliation. So I think what they're trying to say, all these territories have been part of China since time immemorial.
Guermantes, you touched on the militarization. Tell us a little bit more. You talked about runways
and ports.
And ports, that's right.
They also have missiles there, surface-to-air missiles, in other words, against aircraft. They also have surface-to-ship missiles. So basically, they've extended their territorial military capability away from the mainland. Now it's basically they're extending it into the South Asian Sea, and therefore they plan to take it over. And one of my arguments is that when you talk about Taiwan, an invasion, it's not just going to be an invasion of Taiwan. My interpretation is it will also be taking that territory.
In fact, what the U.S. military officials have been saying is that this is the most serious military buildup in the last 20 years. And they are reclaiming the islands, they are building artificial islands, and 3 of these islands that have been built are fully military equipped. So I think the situation is much more serious than we are actually anticipating it to be.
But however, Xi Jinping actually promised Barack Obama that he wouldn't build out the islands. Is that correct?
Well, he promised that he would not build up Scarborough Shoal, not the other islands. That was the compromise with the whole issue with the Philippines and China. But they still control Scarborough Shoal. They have ships around it. They do harassment to the Philippine fishing fleet. They're still doing their aggressive activities. It's just that so far, they haven't officially militarized it in the sense of weaponizing it, but they control it. And if you look at its location, it's very close. It is inside the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines, and so they're doing actions that are very relevant to legal warfare. In other words, using the law to sort of push the limit of their claims.
Sana, tell us. Bring us into more recent history. You were talking about, the historical claims, maybe starting from the 1980s. What sort of harassment are we talking about? Are we talking about sort of lethal harassment?
I think more than harassment, it's like how China has been treating the Southeast Asian claimants. Wang Yi went to Southeast Asia and he actually called these countries smaller states, and these smaller states do not have capability to stand up to China. So I think this direct harassment has been there for a very long time, this divide and rule. I won't really call it harassment because I think there is this strategy of offering carrot and sticks to even Southeast Asian states. And this is how China's approach toward the Southeast Asian claimants have been.
Okay, would you agree with that? Not really harassment?
No, I would agree. No, I would say it is in addition to what Sana said, is also harassment. For example, 1974, the PRC took the Paracel Islands. 1988, they took Johnson Reef and killed 74 Vietnamese sailors. And then they also took, in 1994, Mischief Reef from the Philippines. And then, of course, they declared the nine dash line. And so, in addition to that, there have been incidences of in the air and the sea. In the air, there have been there's a case of a PLA fighter getting too close to many of the U.S. aircraft, including a reconnaissance aircraft, which is not armed. In another case, specifically, they actually got in front of an Australian P-8 and put chaff in the back, and it could have crashed the airplane because the chaff could have gotten to the engines and crashed it. And on the sea, they've done ramming, they've done lasing, they've done where people have died on the ramming part. So it's more than it is harassment. In addition to what Sana said.
Okay, and we still class that as grey zone tactics.
Yes, but the problem is it can escalate very quickly.
Yeah.
If
people died, then.
Well, in the case of the Vietnamese, people did die. I mean, in the P-8, there were Americans on board and Australians, and a crew of over 30 people could have died. And when things like that happen, we don't know necessarily what's going to be the outcome.
So, as we discussed, Taiwan has asserted its claim to Taiping Island in the Spratlys, and it claims almost the same territory as China. To find out more about the position of the ROC, Republic of China, I spoke earlier to Chen Binghui, an associate professor at National Chengchi University's Department of Diplomacy. Let's take a look. Many are aware of China's claims in the South China Sea because of their assertiveness. Taiwan also has claims. Tell us about the 9-dash line, a map, where it came from, and also Taiwan's claims.
In fact, PRC's claims in South China Sea come from Taiwan's claim. We actually claim the same thing.
So how did that happen?
So in the aftermath of World War II, Japanese troops withdrew from the South Pacific, and therefore abandoning a lot of islands, small islands. And ROC Navy, the Taiwan Navy, occupied those islands, surveyed those islands, and drew the 11-dash line. And when the People's Republic of China established, they had territorial negotiation with Vietnam after the Vietnam War, and they resolved the territorial waters near the Bay of Tonkin. So the 11-line become 9-line. And later, the PRC add another line in the east of Taiwan's coast, and right between Japanese occupied island and Taiwan. So right now we could sometimes refer it to the 10-line.
Okay, and so Taiwan, does it pursue its claims?
Taiwan, well, like China, we claim that we have historic rights to the waters in South China Sea.
How many centuries back does that go?
Well, if we were talking about history, it can go back as long as the Ming Dynasty, when more and more Han immigrants moved to South China Sea, and they used South China Sea as for fishing, and they used those islands for shelter. So that's why China and Taiwan both claim that they have historical right, because historically their people use those islands.
And what legal basis does this have?
Well, we have to understand that the claim of the historical rights came before the establishment of UN Law of the Sea. So in the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, actually there are no such thing as historical right. But the claims came before it, so Taiwan and China still grab that claim. Whether this claim is legal or not, that can be arbitrated by according to the UN clause. But of course, the disputants or claimants would not want to do that, right? So you don't see that Taiwan or China try to bring this to a court and you use law to resolve this dispute.
So let's talk about the 2016 International Tribunal ruling, which was taken in 2013 by the Philippines.
Right.
The court ruled that China did not have a legal claim to the South China, to 80-90%. So obviously China disputes that, it rejects that ruling. How about Taiwan?
Well, Taiwan actually disputes that ruling as well. We know, so the court actually ruled out that the features inside South China Sea are not islands. That's the most important thing, because if you have island, you can claim territory, you can claim territorial waters and specialized economic zone. If those are just rocks, features, you cannot claim anything. So that's the main point of that arbitration court.
Tamping Hui of National Chengchi University speaking to me earlier. Now, a spat between Malaysia and China over Malaysian energy projects has bubbled over again. Kasawari field holds an estimated 3 trillion cubic feet of gas reserves and is expected to start production this year. It is more than 100 nautical miles offshore from Borneo and within the Malaysian exclusive economic zone. This is what Beijing had to say.
我想说的是，中国对南沙群岛及其附近海域拥有主权，对相关海域也是拥有管辖权的。所以，中国的船只在中方的管辖海域进行正常的活动是合理合法。
So, G-Man, if Taiping Island is in the hands of Taiwan, this is, an advantage, obviously, to Taiwan and its allies.
Yes. During a conflict, if the PLA controls the South Asian Sea, they could also impose blockade, equivalent, almost a full blockade, not only against Taiwan, but against Japan and South Korea, allies of the U.S. and the Philippines. And this would obviously be very disruptive because the economies of those countries are heavily dependent on Middle Eastern oil and gas. And so the big picture is in addition to the South Asian Sea, the PRC is trying to get control of the Pacific Island countries. We read about that this past couple of months. And also there's activity also in the Indian Ocean on the other side of the Malacca Straits, where the PLA is trying to gain control of the sea from the Myanmar perspective.
Sana, going to another point in Chen's interview, he talked about, Taiwan not relinquishing its claims to the South China Sea. So is that a little bit odd to lump Taiwan together with China, given that it was overturned by the International Court?
I think it's very difficult to separate China's claim from Taiwan or Taiwan's claim for China, because as I've already mentioned, and Professor Chen also mentioned, that PRC actually inherited all those claims from ROC and tweaked it according to its own interests.
But what I mean is that it's still, he says, Taiwan still claims.
I think of all the claims that Taiwan still has on territories of India, South China Sea, I think Taiwan is not really going to abandon its claim. But on the other hand, I don't think that it's really going to press those claims. I think it's not in their interest. But if you look at it, the approach of Taiwan from on the South China Sea, perhaps from 2016, and we compare it to what Taiwan is doing today, I see that Taiwan doesn't really talk about it. It's very much there in the constitution, it's very much there on the government website, but I don't really see Taiwan talking about or pressing its claim on the South China Sea. And in fact, Professor Chen also mentioned that other Southeastern Asian claimants also don't really acknowledge Taiwan's claim.
And is that true?
So I really haven't come across any reference where Southeast Asian countries have talked about Taiwan as a claimant in the South China Sea.
Jiman, let's look at how the South China Sea has intensified U.S. China competition. How has the U.S. become involved?
Well, the U.S. and any country in the world, in fact, can conduct freedom of navigation operations both on the sea and in the air. So these operations have been ongoing for a long period of time. And what's changed is the PLA has been conducting harassing actions against any country, not just the U.S., who transits this area, and including the Taiwan Strait, which they also claim, which is problematic as well. So it is not the case that the countries that are conducting freedom of navigation operations are increasing. It's rather the PLA is now acting more aggressively in all areas. They complain about, even during Macron's visit to China, there was a French frigate that went through the Taiwan Strait, and apparently there was some talk about the fact that they negotiated with the PLA instead of Taiwan. So this is also interesting development.
Yes, exactly. Now, Sana, we want to show now a drawing which shows a country's territorial waters versus international waters. So we can see that the territorial waters essentially is the waters a country has jurisdiction over. It's usually a combination of these: internal waters, the territorial sea, contiguous zone, and the exclusive economic zone, which extends 200 nautical miles. However, in a narrower sense, it can sometimes mean just the territorial sea. Okay, so whereas let's have a look at the international waters stretch from the contiguous zone all the way out to the high seas. So is there a certain level of confusion, do you think, you're a scholar in this area, over these different layers and also the rights within the, in terms of, we saw there that international waters and territorial waters can overlap?
No, I think that specifically in the South China Sea there is utter chaos, and I think this chaos is definitely created by China.
Okay, how do they do that?
Because I think if you look at the position of the Southeast Asian claimants, it's very much aligned with what the UNCLOS has been saying. But if you look at China,
which is
the exclusive economic zone and 12 nautical miles, I think the countries are ready to talk to China, but China is not ready to talk to all these countries, and it was the only country that didn't really accept the UNCLOS ruling, the international, the ICJ ruling.
Right.
So I think this confusion is definitely being created by China, and it's just not about the legal terms, it's just not about the technical terms. How China is approaching the dispute and the countries is also creating utter chaos in the South China Sea.
Jiman, do you have some examples that we can discuss which show up, how exactly it's doing that?
So as you mentioned, in the gray zone actions, the use of water hoses against Vietnamese or Philippine fishing vessels, In fact, besides the case you mentioned about Malaysia, there have been several cases of the Chinese Coast Guard conducting harassing operations, including against, for example, Vietnam's attempt to drill oil in its exclusive economic zone. But getting back to those terms, I believe there are only two terms that are considered legal. One is the territorial waters, which is 12 nautical miles off the coast of a country, and the exclusive economic zone. And those two are sort of the legal terms used in discussions, because in the exclusive
so the territorial sea.
Right, territorial sea, the 12 nautical miles. The exclusive economic zone means that the country that controls that area controls everything below the surface. In other words, not only the mineral rights, but the fish, the food that comes from the sea. It includes also the airspace above. So it means if a plane is flying over that area, it should be under the control of the country nearby. So by refusing to acknowledge the ruling that Sana mentioned, China is basically flaunting the fact that they can get away with it, and no one so far has been able to really counter it in any productive way.
Sana, so the overlapping claim is only to do with each individual sort of neighboring country and China? There's no overlapping claims between the countries themselves?
I think if we talk about overlapping claims as mostly China, Taiwan, and one of the Southeast Asian claimants. So I think from the Southeast Asian countries side, they are not fighting with each other, not in the South China Sea. But despite this, there is no unified position from the Southeast Asian countries. And this is primarily because of China's approach. While ASEAN is looking for a multilateral solution to the problem, what China has been doing is approaching countries at the bilateral level. And if we could go back to 2012 ASEAN summit, that was the very first time that ASEAN could come up with a joint communique. And why? Because Cambodia was the chair, and Cambodia was under Chinese influence, and Philippines and Vietnam wanted a mention of the South China Sea dispute, but Cambodia didn't let it happen. So yeah, this is really creating a lot of confusion in the region.
G-Man, let's go back to the U.S. Transits, because not only, I mean, in terms of the U.S., the issue is that they can sail through, under international law, all of the territorial waters, right? It's not just, in fact, you don't need to just be in international waters. You can also be in the territorial sea, with innocent passage.
Yes, the exclusive economic zone they can pass through. The 12 nautical miles is where the country you're close to has territorial rights and control. They own the 12 miles off the coast.
Sure, but a U.S. ship can still transit through.
They have to work with the country. They can't just.
So their route, when they talk about their routine freedom of operation, freedom of navigation operations, they're actually talking about
beyond the 12
beyond the 12 miles.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, and that was actually the funny story behind that is actually was based on the longest range of an artillery piece that could fire from sea to land. So that's the reason why supposedly the Navy decided to make it 12 miles.
Yeah, and initially it was 3 miles cannonball, right?
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And so let's dig in a little bit more, Sana. So in terms of China and the U.S. coming sort of butting heads here, every time that there is a transit from the U.S., China will say that the U.S. is illegally entering its waters. Is that correct?
I don't think so, as G-Man also mentioned that when there is a FONOP happening and when there is a visit, which most of the time is referred to as friendly visits to port, it's in alignment or permission from the host countries. So I don't think that China could actually, of course, China is calling it illegal. China is calling the U.S. as a provocator and an outsider power. U.S. still not considered a part of the region when we just talk about China's position. So definitely from China's perspective, it's illegal, but definitely it's happening in alignment with the Southeast Asian countries. And this is what Southeast Asian countries want. There is a lot of gap in terms of military between Southeast Asian claimants and China. What they want to do is to internationalize the internationalization of the issue, and at the same time, they really want the U.S. countries such as U.S., Japan, and India to come and have exercises in the South China Sea.
Guermantes, so can you see any resolution to these problems?
Well, the resolution is for the Chinese Communist Party to stop being aggressive, which is impossible for them, in my opinion. And so they're going to be aggressive, especially when they're getting away with it. And so that's one way. The other way is to get enough countries involved and to push back on their aggressiveness and say, hey, we will not tolerate this. This is not professional. This is not according to the agreed upon rules of engagement that most of the world has agreed upon, so stop it. But right now there hasn't been a unified effort in this aspect in terms of a total regional and total, let's say, acknowledged Navy way of doing it or the Air Force way of doing it. So those are my only two ways of getting out of this.
So Sana, is there a risk of military escalation in the South China Sea?
I don't think there would be an intentional conflict, but there's definitely a risk of escalation. And I feel this is primarily because of whatever China has been doing. And I think to stop that, the only solution could be that ASEAN has to be stronger. And ASEAN as a bloc has to tell China that nothing doing and we have to negotiate as a bloc. Because as a bloc, it is much more stronger than individual countries, and then there is no unified position. So I think ASEAN has to really step up and deal with China here.
Okay. Sana, Hashmi and Guermantes Lailari, thank you very much for joining Taiwan Talks today.
Thank you.
Now, finally in the show today, the US conducts what it calls freedom of navigation operations, as we mentioned, through international waters, including the Taiwan Strait and the South China Sea. China recently complained about the USS Milius, an American Navy destroyer sailing around the disputed Paracels and the Spratlys. Our next guest is Greg Poling, the director of the Southeast Asia Program and Asia Maritime Transparency Initiative, a senior fellow at Center for Strategic and International Studies based in Washington, and an author of On Dangerous Ground. I asked him whether China's accusations of illegal transits were true. Recently, China has said that the USS Milius destroyer has made illegal transit in the Spratlys as well as the Paracels. Is that true? Is it illegal?
No, not to anybody who isn't a state lawyer in Beijing. So the transit 2 days ago was past Mischief Reef, which is one of the features in the Spratlys. It is underwater in its natural state. It's one of these islands that China artificially created after 2013. And the 2016 arbitral award specifically says that Mischief Reef does not exist. It is not an island. It is a piece of the seabed and it belongs to the Philippines. So what the USS Milius did was it went within 12 miles, which would be the territorial sea if there was one, and then it conducted normal operations to prove that there is no territorial sea, that China's claim is illegal. The operation 2 weeks ago in the Paracels challenged a different Chinese claim. China has what it calls straight baselines around the Paracels. It's basically taken tens of thousands of square miles of what should be international waters and claimed that they're internal waters of China in gross violation of international law.
So it's not illegal to sail through what we class as territorial waters. Is that correct?
Correct, but that's not what happened in either of these cases. Now, under international law, if you have territorial waters, international law guarantees all vessels the right of what's called innocent passage. You can go from point A to point B in territorial waters. And that is what the U.S. does around some of the islands that China claims that the U.S. recognizes as islands. In this case, that's not what happened. Mischief Reef is not an island. It does not have territorial waters. And in the case of the Paracels, the U.S. did not challenge territorial waters. The U.S. challenged these gross straight baselines that China has declared around the whole archipelago, which nobody else in the world recognizes.
So it seems that the South China Sea is another point of conflict between China and the U.S. Do you see any resolution to this?
The South China Sea disputes cannot be resolved. The positions of the claimants are mutually exclusive. They can be managed. They were managed for many decades. What has changed is that over the last 10 years, Xi Jinping has elevated this issue within the domestic political context in China. It's become kind of uncompromisable under his leadership. It's hard to see how the tensions can be dialed back and managed as long as Beijing maintains this uncompromising position. The U.S.'s position is that China's claims are legal. That is also the position of almost everybody else in the world. The real problem here is between China and the other claimants. And the Philippines, Vietnam, Indonesia, Malaysia, they are the ones who are on the end of China's coercion.
The code of conduct, which has been kicking around, I understand, for about 20 years, do you see this as being an answer at all?
Unfortunately, no. I mean, so the code of conduct has been in the ether. It's been negotiated for more than 25 years now. The Philippines actually wrote the first draft of the code of conduct at the behest of the rest of ASEAN, the Association of South Asian Nations, in 1998. China, at that time, refused to compromise on any of the fundamental issues that would be necessary. It won't agree on what the geographic scope of the disputes is. It won't agree to make it legally binding. Those same issues are at stake today. So the reason the code of conduct failed 20 years ago has not changed. And Beijing has shown no willingness to meet Vietnam or the Philippines or Indonesia halfway.
How has China sought to frame the U.S. in the South China Sea?
So China's position, particularly over the last 10 years, has focused on this narrative of containment, that everything that's happening in the South China Sea is caused by a U.S. containment strategy backed up by Japan. The problem with that is that it only resonates with certain foreign partners. It does not actually resonate in the region, because if you're in the Philippines, your problem is not that the U.S. is telling you to stand for China. The problem is that China's stealing your fish, stealing your oil and gas. The same is true in Vietnam or Malaysia or the Philippines or Indonesia or Japan or India. China's refusal to recognize its own role in these tensions, and its refusal to acknowledge that any of its neighbors have their own decision-making power, is a big part of the problem here, right? It refuses to acknowledge that this isn't a U.S. plot.
And if we look on the other side, if we want to talk about framing, then the U.S., as well as its friends and allies, will talk about a rules-based order, and that obviously China is breaking that, backed up by the International Tribunal.
We use the term rules-based order a lot, and China likes to complain about parts of the rules-based order, and China has reason to complain about some parts of the rules-based order. It wasn't there when some of these rules were written. It was there when UNCLOS was written. China, in fact, had a privileged seat at the table. China wrote these rules. It had as much hand in it as the U.S. or the Philippines or anybody else. The rules have not changed. China has. China liked these rules until the 1990s. And now a more powerful China has decided that the rules no longer apply.
And so say if in a scenario where, Beijing is building up the militarizing the islands, and as you even said, mischiefully creating an island that wasn't even there before, in a scenario where China does own the South China Sea, what happens?
Well, one, the U.S.-Philippine alliance probably dies, because if the Philippines looks around one day and says, we're your oldest ally in the region, we provided basing for decades, we continue to provide support, and you couldn't even help us defend our legal rights, it really undermines the whole regime underpinned by the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea. Because this could not be simpler. The UN Convention on the Law of the Sea says every country on Earth, big or small, gets 200 miles of water, and China says, no, I get 1,000. You can't have a rules-based system in which China gets to say, no, I get 5 times as much as everybody else on Earth because I want it.
And how about in terms of international trade and also owning all of those rich resources?
The resources are a bit of a red herring. If you took every drop of oil known to exist in the South China Sea and you dropped it in China tomorrow, it accounts for about 2 years of daily oil consumption. The natural gas can really only be piped to the nearest coastline. So Philippine gas only helps the Philippines. Vietnamese gas only helps Vietnam. So it's not about oil and gas to China. It's also not about fish. Chinese fishermen do not fish commercially in the South China Sea. They only operate because they're subsidized. Trade is a problem. It is the busiest trading route on the planet, although the cost of diverting around Australia is not that big for most of the players. The people who would be hurt are countries like Vietnam and Thailand, to a degree Malaysia and Singapore, who literally have no path to the sea other than through the South China Sea.
So then what happens? What's the global scenario, the global economic scenario?
So I want to preface it with, it's very difficult for me to envision a world in which either the US or China intentionally block commercial traffic through the South China Sea. But this is not the biggest concern. I mean, the biggest concern would be that we would wake up in a world in which there is no such thing as international law anymore, that big powers take what they want and small powers suffer what they must.
It would mean that might is right.
We would be, it would suggest that the entire project of the last 100 years was a fantasy, a mirage, and that really we're going back to the rules of the jungle.
If we add that up to what China is doing to Taiwan, what's the combination of these two together?
Look, there are clear parallels. Beijing still views itself as the weaker of the military parties. It would rather not have to test its military strength against the US if it can afford it. And it knows that its greatest advantages are asymmetric. It has the world's largest coast guard. It has the world's largest fishing flotilla. It has the world's largest militia. It's using militia forces in the South China Sea, militia forces in the Taiwan Strait, illegal dredging around Kinmen and Matsu, constant Coast Guard patrols around the Senkakus, all to put pressure on U.S. partners and allies in the hopes of wearing them down, of convincing them that resistance is futile, and all keeping this below the threshold at which the U.S. could justify military intervention. And that presents a real dilemma for the U.S. and its partners and allies. Because if China can win without fighting, then those partners now are going to look around and say, what's the point in being a U.S. ally if it doesn't defend my rights?
So what does the U.S. do?
Well, what the U.S. is struggling to do, although I think it's beginning to find its footing, is to work more closely with a diverse network of allies and partners to combine capacity building for those states with diplomatic efforts, public transparency and naming and shaming campaigns, trying to impose non-military cost on Beijing while enhancing the resiliency of partners and allies, and kind of really settling in for what's going to be a long challenge.
Hello, I'm Ian Kavat of Taiwan Talks. If you liked our show, please search for us on YouTube, give us a thumbs up and hit subscribe to our channel. Feel free to leave us any feedback in the comments section, or you can follow me on Twitter. See you next time.